we believe a lot of crazy things. And one of the crazy things is what we just saw right here, that God became one of us, which is kind of a strange thought. Like if you grew up in the U.S., right, or you kind of have a church background as a kid, this is like, oh yeah, like this is normal. But okay, if you like stop as a rational human being and you think about this, it's like, okay, wait a minute, like, you know, I'm not really sure I can go with you on that. God became one of us. In fact, the person that did the most complete job, I would say, of explaining this concept was a guy named John, the Apostle John. Okay, so there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And John was one of the disciples. He followed Jesus around for 3 years. And he came to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. But then Jesus was crucified, and John thought, oh, shoot, we were wrong. And then he saw Jesus resurrected, and he thought, yikes, like, okay, I guess this runs way deeper than we ever imagined. And so John started trying to figure it all out, and he started telling everybody that he could about Jesus. And the Roman emperor, eventually, Emperor Domitian, he didn't like John. Because everywhere John went, people became followers of Jesus. And so Domitian thought, well, maybe I should just put John to death. That's what we do with people we don't like. Except every time the Romans would kill a Christian, like 10 more would spring up. It was the weirdest thing. And so Emperor Domitian took John and he decided to have him banished to a little island. And John lived out his life on the island of Patmos. Now, no one else has this, but I was able to dig up a photo of John on that island. And there he is on the island of Patmos, where John grew to be very old. He's like the only disciple who became an apostle. Like, he's the only one that wasn't martyred. He's the only one that was exiled to an island the way that he was. And he grew old and he died on that island. But in his later years, John did a lot of writing. He wrote the Gospel of John. Okay, so he wrote one of the 4 accounts of Jesus' life that we utilize. He wrote some short letters to his friends, and they're just called 1st, 2nd, and 3rd what? Yeah, so super original there. And then he wrote a book called the Book of Revelation, which is awesome. But John, when he sat down to write his gospel, like his summary of the life of Jesus, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to write this down. I'm getting to the end of my life, and I'm going to write this down, and I want people to be able to read this forevermore. He sat down to try to describe what he had heard and what he had seen and what he had experienced. And here's what he tells us about Jesus at the very beginning of this. And he refers to Jesus as something called the Word, as if Jesus was the way God would speak to us. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. So Jesus, he's saying, was with God in the beginning. Now we go, okay, well, the beginning of what? Well, everything. He was with God, and he was God. And we go, well, how does that work? And John doesn't really explain it much. It's kind of like it's a huge mystery. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And here's what John says. In verse 14, he says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So John's now an old man. He's writing this, and he's reflecting back to what he saw, and he decides to write it down now because his time is limited. His days of telling people about this are coming to an end. And so the best way he can think of, he describes his time with Jesus. And he says that God came down from heaven, and he lived among us. Guys, what if that's true? Like, what if that really happened? What if John was right? And what if all the other guys were right? Like Peter was right. What if Paul was right? What if James and Jude, like the little brothers of Jesus, what if they were right? What if that turns out to be true? Okay, what if that's all true? Then I think the big question is why? Why did God come to live among us as one of us. Why would he do that? Because, and this is important to consider, in those days, nobody was expecting this. Like, this all happened in a little nation called what? Israel. Okay, among Jewish people. But the Jewish people were absolutely not expecting this. They were expecting a man to come and lead them to freedom, a Messiah to help them overthrow their enemies, to reestablish Israel as a strong, independent nation. But nobody was expecting the Messiah to be God in a human body. Nobody was looking for that. In fact, the idea of it was outright offensive to Jewish people. And this is why Jewish people had such a hard time accepting Jesus along the way. He just didn't fit into their God box. He blew up their God box. But it wasn't just the Jewish people that weren't expecting this. I mean, like, nobody was expecting this. I mean, you look at the ancient religions and nobody was expecting God to come down to us. Everybody in the ancient religions was trying to move up to God. Like Pharaoh. Pharaoh was trying to convince everybody that he was a deity, that he was a god, right? And the Roman emperors, they were striving for deification. Julius Caesar and Nero, and many of you that have studied history, you know all about this. I mean, it's just history. It's well documented. But the thinking of the time was, maybe, under the right circumstances, like, we could become like God. But nobody was expecting God to come in our direction. Not the Egyptians, not the Greeks, not the Romans, and most certainly not the Jews. And what adds to the idea is that he shows up as a baby. How fragile, right? How vulnerable, how tiny, how insignificant. I mean, that's just not going to happen. Like, if you were going to make up a story about God coming to live with people, and you're just making up the story, this is not how you do it. It's like a clear, sunny day, right? And there's an earthquake, and it rumbles, and then everybody stops, and then, like, whoom, here comes God to live with men. But the thing about the story of Jesus is that if you're going to make up a story like this is not how anybody would write it. But the men who saw it and the men who lived it, Peter, John, James, and the others, they said, you know what? We can't really explain it, but this is how it happened. He showed up as a baby, living in the home of a carpenter, and he trained to become a carpenter. And then he stepped onto the scene of history, and as we watched and we listened, and as we watched and listened and watched and listened, when it was all over, we've come to this conclusion: that God came to live among people. Like, what if that's true? So here's what we're doing in this series. We're wrestling with the question, why? Now, the Sunday school answer to that question is, well, to die and pay for our sins. And that's true, right? That is true, and that's really, really important, and we are going to get to that eventually. But that's not all there is to it. And we talked about last week, Jesus' revolutionary view of people. That he labeled people in very different ways. And his view of people was infuriating to some, and it was completely liberating to others. But today I want us to think about another huge reason that Jesus came. And this kind of gets fleshed out in a conversation that Jesus had with his disciples. And so let me kind of set up the scene. Right after the Last Supper, Jesus lays out for his guys what's about to happen. Now, he's been alluding to this, but now he really lays it out. And he essentially says, guys, I'm leaving, but don't worry. And the disciples are like, are you kidding? You're leaving. Really? You're leaving. Like, what in the world? You're leaving, but you don't want us to worry. Are you crazy? And Peter's like, looking around at all the other guys, he's like, yeah, I don't know what they're talking about, Jesus. That's fine. You can leave, but I'm going with you. So, because like I'm your guy, these guys, all these guys are just losers, but I'm going with you. So wherever you go, I'm going with you. And Jesus is like, oh man, Pete, I appreciate the devotion. And I know you're sincere, but that's not how this is going to go. This is going to go in a way different direction than you think. And that's where we pick this up. Okay, Jesus says, John chapter 14, verse 1, he says, do not let your hearts be troubled. He says, you believe in God, believe also in me. He says, hey guys, like don't be all upset. And they're like, but Jesus, you just told us you're leaving. And he's like, yeah, I know, but don't worry about it. Because you guys believe in God, right? And they're like, yep, we believe in God. He's like, great. Well, just believe in me also. Now, let me tell you something. If you're ever in a conversation with somebody and they say this to you, you should get up and leave the room. Like, you don't have to say anything. You just get up and you walk out. Because this is the kind of thing that crazy people say. You trust God, don't you? Yeah. Well, then just trust me. Just trust me the way you trust God. This is either completely ridiculous or it's true. And Jesus had this habit of being like really polarizing in that kind of way. He continues. He says, my Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And so here he goes, talking about going again. He says, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. And they're like, wait, what? You're leaving, and you're going to your Father's house. What does that even mean? Where is your Father's house? You have a father, your Father's house. I'm like, well, how come you've never taken us there? And they're like, John's like, Pete, have you been to his father's house? James, you been to his father's? They're like, no. He's like, yeah, me neither. What are you talking about, your Father's house? You're going there to prepare a place for each of us, and then later you're going to come and get us, and you're going to take us all there. Like, what are you talking about? And so, like, Jesus is spelling this out. There's a few raised hands in the room. He pretends like he doesn't see it. And he says, in verse 4, he says, you know the way to the place where I'm going. You know the way. And they're all looking at each other like, we know the way. Really. We don't even know what you're talking about, man. Now, just a little side note about that little phrase, the way. Later on, when Jesus was gone and the movement started, like the Christian movement started, nobody knew what to call it. There wasn't a name for it. Jesus didn't say, hey, when I'm gone, call yourselves Christians. The word Christian, that didn't actually develop until a little while later on. And it wasn't the followers of Jesus that called themselves that initially. This word kind of came into use because it's what the Romans called them. But it turns out that the Romans used it as a derogatory term. So the word Christian just means, does anybody know? Little Christ. Just means little Christ. That's what Christian means, little Christ. Now, we think of that, we hear that, we go, well, that's not derogatory. But originally, the idea was, okay, just like Jesus of Nazareth, that criminal died as a criminal on a cross, so too his stupid little followers are willing to die. Look at all of them. Look at all of them going to crosses just like their king. Look at those stupid little Christs. And before long, that term, it just stuck. And it came to have great meaning to the ones who were actually giving their lives. But before the word Christian became popular, they just called themselves followers of the way. Because they knew they were trying to live life in a completely different way, the way of Jesus, or just the way. So Jesus says, you know the way to the place where I'm going. And then it says, Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? And he's just like, okay, we know you know what you're talking about. At least we hope you know what you're talking about. But we don't have a clue what you're talking about. You're going, but you said, don't worry about it because you're gonna come back and then you're going to take us to where you were before you came back to get us to take you where you were and where you're going. And what are you talking about? And so Thomas is like, we don't need to worry because we know the way. Sorry to disagree with you, Jesus, but we do not know the way. And it says, then Jesus answered, I am the way. Jesus is like, so you do know the way. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now, if you're here and you're not a Christian, right, or you're just kind of skeptical, I want to give you permission to be skeptical. In fact, if you're going to reject Christianity, this is why right here. This is it. It shouldn't be because you've had some bad experiences with people that call themselves followers of Jesus or Christians or whatever. I mean, bad experiences with people who poorly represent something is not a reason to not believe in the thing. That's not a good reason to reject Jesus. But this claim right here, this is a good reason. This claim is offensive, and this claim is narrow, and this claim is absolutely absurd unless it's true. And this is really the issue when it comes to Christian faith. And Jesus didn't proclaim this right up front. He didn't say, hey guys, follow me, right? I'm the only way to the Father. He just kind of let them watch, and he let them listen, and he let them see, and he let them experience. And then at the very end, he spells it out for them as clearly as possible. I am the way. I am the way to the Father. If you want to come to the Father, you have to go through me. I am the way. And he goes on. And he says, in fact, if you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. And here, this is crazy. These are Jewish men in a room. And this man that they've been following is equating himself with God. And this is bound to make them very uncomfortable. But Jesus doesn't back away from this. He doesn't shy away. And you have to imagine all the confusion in the room. They're just the discomfort. They're looking around. Jesus is making astounding claims here. Okay, but they have watched crazy stuff. They've seen him do crazy stuff. They've seen the miracles. They've seen healings. They've seen him walk on water. They've seen him in the middle of a storm on a lake where they thought they were all going to drown, and he just says, shh, to the storm, and it all calms. They have seen him bring people back from the dead. And they're like, okay, but if we know you, we know the Father. What? So finally, Philip raises his hand, and he makes a statement. And really, it's more of a question. But here's what's cool about his statement question. This is a statement or a question that I bet you've made before. In fact, if you're here and you say, I'm not a religious person, I bet that you've asked this because this is such a powerful question. Here's what Philip says, kind of interrupting Jesus. It says, Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Okay, so you're going, and then you're coming, right, and all that. And we don't really get it, but here's something that I think we could all get our minds around. Jesus, just show us God. Okay, that we could get our minds around. Just show us the Father, and that will be enough. And here's why I think this is so amazing. Because at some point in your life, whether you are a Christian or you're a follower of Jesus or you're not at all, hasn't there been a point in your life where it's like, okay, if I just knew for certain there is a God, right? If something would just happen or I would see something or experience something, like preferably not late at night in my bedroom, but at some point in my life, God would appear or say something. I mean, if I could just know with certainty that there is a God and he knows about me, that would be enough. And he wouldn't even really have to do anything else. He wouldn't have to heal me or fix anything or do anything. I wouldn't have to win the lottery. But if I could just live the rest of my life going forward with certainty that there is a God and he knows all about me, that would be enough. This is what Philip's saying. It's like, okay, you're confusing all of us. We're not really sure what you're talking about. And you can go and you can take us wherever you want, Lord. But how about this? Could you just show us the Father? I mean, that's it. If you just do that, that's all we need. That will be enough. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you such a long time? And I wonder if Philip was like, wait, I don't think you understood my question. And all the disciples in the room, they're looking around at each other and they're like, wait, is he saying what we think he's saying? He continues, anyone, just to clarify, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? In other words, you want to see God. Really? You want to see God. You want to see the Father. Jesus is like, man, I am standing right in front of you, Philip. Don't you see it? Don't you understand? Don't you see it? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Don't you understand what you've been watching this whole time? Jesus says, don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. He's just like, guys, listen. All the words I've been saying, all my teaching about God, I'm not saying any of it just on my own authority. Okay, all of it is the Father speaking through me. In other words, you want to know what God says? Listen to me. If you really want to know what God thinks, what God has to say, Jesus says, listen to me. Because this whole time, all the work, all the miracles, all the compassion, the way that I've loved irreligious people far from God, all the kindness, all the work, it is just the Father living in me doing his work. In other words, you want to know what God is up to? Watch me, Jesus says. You want to know how God would respond? Watch me. You want to know how God reacts or how God would feel? Watch me. You want to know what God would do? Watch me. And this is so central to why Jesus came into the world, so central to why God came to live among us. One of the huge reasons was to communicate and to demonstrate to us what God is like. And this is so cool. It's so cool to me because God wants to know each of us on a personal level. So much so that he was not content to just send information. He sent himself. God was so interested in you making this personal, not just like categorical, that he showed up. Because for finite human beings, to try to understand an infinite God, what better way to help us understand than to enter our world and become one of us? So God is saying to you, and he's saying to me, I want you to know me so badly that I'm working at your capacity. Instead of you just looking up and having this huge mystery and trying to figure it all out on your own, I decided to come down and live among you because I really, really want you to know me. I don't want you to have to guess. I don't want you to have to just sort of look around and try to figure it all out. And this is what makes Jesus so unique. See, Jesus didn't claim to have the best explanation of God. Jesus did not claim to have the best explanation of God. Jesus claimed to be the best explanation of God. And this is what sets Jesus apart. Because for thousands and thousands of years, teachers and preachers and prophets and religious leaders have come. Many have come and they have claimed to have an explanation of God. But Jesus shows up and he says something ridiculous. Jesus shows up and he says, you know what? I want you to look at me because I am the explanation. Guys, if that's true, that's awesome. And if he's lying, then like this is one of those rooms where you might want to just like get up and leave because with Jesus, it only gets crazier from here, right? But if you're a Christian and you take the New Testament seriously and you believe these guys actually saw the stuff they say they saw, And then they risk their lives to teach other people about it and to write it down. And you believe that our faith really does have history behind it. And this is amazing. Because it means that your best opportunity to get to know what God is like is to listen to what Jesus says and to watch what Jesus does. But here's the thing. As Christians, for whatever reason, like we know this, if you're a Christian, you've been following Jesus for a long time, I haven't given you anything you didn't already know this morning. But we get really confused about this. And we like to look other places for our information about God, to find out about God. Okay, we have Jesus, like this extraordinary picture of God that we can begin to get our minds around, and yet we like to look in lots of other directions at lots of other stuff. So let me highlight some stuff. For instance, we like to look at our circumstances. Now, this one is huge because Christians do this all the time. In fact, if you're new to Christianity, Christians just get so weird. If you're new to Christianity, you'll hear Christians say crazy stuff along these lines. We say stuff like, oh yeah, that was totally a God moment. Or, that was such a God thing. And if you're new to all this and you're listening to Christians talk, it's like, what? Okay, wait a minute. Okay, I know what God is, I think. I know what a thing is. What in the world is a God thing? Did you just make that up? Because here's what we do. Even as Jesus people, they go, Jesus is the Son of, he's our picture. We're constantly trying to look around at our life and piece together events and say, oh, there's God, right? Oh, that must have been God. Oh, that must have been God. Oh, that must have been God. And the problem is, with that whole approach, we are horrible at interpreting circumstances. We're horrible. It's pitiful. And you know what? It's so obvious when you listen to other people say it. Right? I mean, come on. Idiots. But I have lots of God moments. I got God things left and right, but if you've been a Christian, listen, if you've been a Christian for more than 5 years, you could come up here and you could tell your story right now about how this happened and I was so sure it was God, right? And then things changed and situation changed and my life changed and I'm like, yeah, I don't think that was God. Or for you, maybe it's the other way around, right? You're like, oh man, I had this great job and I had this great life, and then I lost my job because of the recession or because the company went under, and then I had to move back to Seattle, and I had to move back in with my parents, and I was like, God, where are you? God, where are you? But then after I got home, my mom got sick. And I realized I was right where I needed to be to take care of her and to help my dad. And now I see that the whole deal was just a huge God thing. Okay, so you were sure God had turned his back on you, and now you're sure he was totally with you the whole time. Trying to interpret circumstances, trying to figure out God through circumstances. Man, it's so fun. It's so fun. The problem is, it can only get you so far. Or you think about this scenario. Some of you will be able to relate to this. Sometimes parents and kids have a little tension. You notice that? Because they want different things for the kids. So, imagine a 17-year-old girl comes home from school and she's like, oh man, I'm so mad at God right now. I'm so mad. And you're just like, oh, what's wrong, little sweetie? She's like, well, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed that he would ask me to prom, and he didn't ask me to prom. God doesn't answer prayer. And then Mama's like, well, I prayed and prayed and prayed that he wouldn't ask you to prom. So God totally answers prayer. All right? I mean, which one is it? I mean, interpreting circumstances, it's so fun, it's interesting. But if we're left to just try to figure out God by our ability to interpret our own circumstances, we're only going to get so far. Here's another one that we love. We look to our religious traditions, right? I mean, how could we not? Of course we do. Like if you were raised in a church, you were handed some beliefs about God by adults in your world. And those were just sort of ingrained in you as a kid. Like if you grew up in the Catholic Church, it's don't and do and don't and do, right? And it's stand up and sit down and stand up and sit down. And there is a way to do it, right? And if you're Catholic, you're going, are you ripping on me? No, I'm just saying how it is. If you were raised in a conservative, really conservative church, a Baptist church or a Pentecostal church, I mean, you had all kinds of thoughts pounded into your brain about sex and about relationships and about how to dress appropriately and about alcohol and about dancing, right? You had some strong traditions. Now, they were different from your Catholic friends. You're like, man, they have so much fun. Dang. And they're like, yeah, but we got to stand and sit and stand and sit. And you're like, yeah, but you can dance. If you were raised in a really liberal, like super liberal church, there were probably marches and protests and all of this stuff all the time. And for some of you, growing up in a certain tradition, in certain churches, it had a really political bent to it. In fact, some of you, when you became a Christian, you were sure that you became a Democrat. Right? Others of you, hey, listen, there are churches that are, some of you are like, I can't even fathom that. Like, no, there are, it's okay. Others of you, right? You thought, look, if you're not a Republican, you're not a Christian. Some of you are going, wait, what are you saying? And it was crazy because depending on your tradition, Jesus was totally behind your particular political persuasion as well. Because it turns out actually Jesus was a Republican, or Jesus was a Democrat, or he was libertarian, whatever the religious system bought into, that's exactly what Jesus was, right? Because this is what happens with religious systems. They start making claims in all kinds of arenas. This is what religious systems do. So here's the problem with looking to religious traditions. Traditions systematize, overemphasize, and fossilize. And some of you are like, well, I'll explain those in a second. But I want to say before I get into that, I'm like a professional religious person, so I can say these things. Religious traditions, they tend to go sideways after time. They just do. Because in a religious system, we want answers. That's why we have a religious system. We want answers. We want yes and yes and no. See, nobody who's propagating a system wants to say, oh man, I have no idea. I have no answer for that. No, we want to say like, no. Here's what the Bible says, or the Scripture teaches, or God says. We want answers. We want to create systems, and I want to say that's not necessarily all bad. Like organizing our thoughts is not a horrible thing. Helps us get our mind around some things. But when we start creating systems that have all the answers, we get ourselves into some big trouble, because the problem is life just as life comes along, it just keeps spitting out new questions. In fact, some of you, I'm betting that some of you got real turned off by your church at some point. Because at some point, and maybe when you were a kid or as a teenager, you had questions. You had questions and you asked them in Sunday school, or you asked your youth leader, and they looked at you and they just shut you down. Because they're like, a kid asking questions and I don't have the answer. I don't know what to do with that. You need more faith. And they panicked, right? And it scared them. And so they just told you to get in line. And you were like, really? I can't ask some questions? And you walked away. Because the religious system turned you off. It had these real tight boundaries, like in super weird places. And this is what religious systems do. They systematize. And another thing that happens is they overemphasize. Like when you read the Bible, and this is one of the challenging things intellectually about reading the Bible. When you read the Bible, you come across concepts that are in tension with each other sometimes. Right? There are complex issues that apparently are true simultaneously. Concepts that are really difficult for us to reconcile. So what religious traditions do is they just really emphasize one, and they get it, and then they minimize the other. And this happens in virtually every religious system, including this one, including what we're doing here. We have to be really careful. And then over time, those traditions fossilize. They get so hard and they get so inflexible that they just become outdated. Like an idea gets accepted at one point, and then no one challenges it, and no one challenges it, and after time and after more time, it turns out no one is actually free to challenge it. Like, some of you know that there were people that gave their lives because they kept insisting that the earth was not at the center of the solar system. That was a religious teaching. And if you said differently, you needed to get a fake ID, and you couldn't work, you couldn't get a job anywhere. Like religious traditions, they have value. They have value for sure. That's kind of part of what we're doing here. But I think they can be helpful. But if they become the primary way that you figure out what God is like, problem is, man, that's going to be limited. And for some of you, this is a little more sensitive. You had a tradition. And you watched the way your tradition dealt with people that you loved. Like maybe your mom and your dad, they got divorced. And you saw the church react. And they had all kinds of thoughts about marriage and divorce and remarriage and all of that. And what you watched is your parents in a time of unbelievably great need just be isolated and cut off. And you've wrestled with anger or hurt your whole life about that. Or maybe like your sister got pregnant and your parents had to meet the priest, or they had to meet with the pastor, and then they had to meet with all the elders, and then you heard people talking and there were all these rumors, and you just looked at the whole situation and you're like, it just feels wrong. It feels really, really wrong. Like whatever it might have been, you saw some religious tradition in play. And to be honest, to this day, you have a hard time separating God from what you saw. You saw judgment. You saw a lack of compassion. You saw whatever you saw. And to this day, it has impacted your view of God. Now, I just want to say, okay, religious traditions can be wonderful, and they often are. But when it comes to helping us understand what God is like, they're limited. There's a much better way to understand what God is like. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. Okay, let me hit two more just real quick. We also like to look within. We look within. Now, the problem with that is pretty obvious. Within is limited to what's within. Right? So you're only going to get so far. Like as long as your whole approach is just meditating or getting quiet, as long as you're just looking inside yourself, you're limited to whatever is inside yourself. Now, I'm not saying that quiet and meditation are a bad thing at all. In fact, that can be really helpful. It's just that God is bigger than whatever happens to be in you. It's limited. And here's another thing that we know. I just think we know this. The more you experience life, the more this becomes obvious to you. The 16-year-old version of what's within, I mean, come on now. It's different than the 30-year-old version of what's within, right? I hope so. Which is different than the 60-year-old version of what's within, I'm hoping. I'll get there eventually. And so you go, oh, okay, that's what. So which one of those then is God? Or here's another important thing. And for some of you, and this is not, I know that this is really personal, I know, but what's within you really depends for you on if you take a tiny little pill every day. Because like without the pill, one thing is within. And then with the pill, it's amazing, something entirely different is within. And it's interesting because sometimes the people that know you best, like the people that you live with every day, they're like, hey, we like the you with the pill, right? We like the you with the pill better than the you without the pill. But it turns out the you with the pill and the you without the pill are two very different versions of God within, right? So getting quiet and meditating and looking within, there's some value to that. It's not a bad thing. It's just limited. And then one more place we look to nature. And nature is great, right? Nature is beautiful, can be beautiful and just majestic, and it can definitely show us something about God, about his creativity and his majesty. But again, even that is kind of limited. Like nature, I think nature is awesome from like far away. You know, it's like so beautiful from far away. But nature up close, it'll kill you. So like nature, like from the, on the couch, like on the National Geographic Channel, it's like, wow, that's epic, right? But then if you were to like get face to face with it, like when you can touch it and smell it and actually see the circle of life, here's the problem. Nature is survival of the fittest. I mean, what's big and what's strong and what's fast and smart eats what's small and weak and slow and dumb. That's how it works. There's no mercy in nature. Not when you get up real close to it. There's no compassion in nature. There's no kindness in nature. There's no patience in nature. So, like, can you learn something about God from nature? Well, sure you can, but you need more. There are things that are true of God that you will never learn simply from looking at nature. And this just brings us back to the whole deal this morning. This is why Jesus is so amazing. I mean, yes, we can learn about God from our circumstances and from our religious traditions, and I hope we do. And we can learn by looking within, and I hope we do. And we can learn from nature, and I hope we do that too. But none of that will show us what Jesus shows us. So why did Jesus come and dwell among us? He came to communicate and demonstrate what God is like. Jesus is the clearest picture of God that we can ever get in this life. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean for you? Well, it means that regardless of your current circumstances and your interpretation of what those circumstances tell you about God, Jesus is the clearest picture of God you could ever get. So if you're going through something hard and you're drawing all kinds of conclusions about God because of it, I just want to say maybe you need to let go of evaluating and interpreting the circumstances and just get yourself back to Jesus. Or maybe you're here and you've been really, really turned off by some religious tradition. Maybe you've seen some stuff that makes you just want to throw up. It's the same thing. I mean, if that's keeping you from God, maybe you just need to go back to Jesus. And I just want to say that guys, there has never, ever, ever been anyone like Jesus. And he's giving us a simple invitation. He's saying, if you want to know what God is like, if you really want to know what God is like, if you truly are interested in finding out what God is like, Jesus says, look at me. And that's the invitation. And as followers of Jesus, that's our focus, that's our gaze. And if our gaze begins to be something else, we got to come back to Jesus.